It's a pleasure to speak with you. Some of you were here last night when I spoke, and I'm going to develop in a little more detail an argument that I introduced last night. And in doing so, I am speaking from a book that was recently published called The Way of Medicine, Ethics in the Healing Profession. So if you've read that book, some of this will sound quite familiar. The book is written with my colleague, Chris Tollefson, who's the chair of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. And he and I taught together, we're still teaching together, an annual one-week medical ethics intensive for aspiring physicians. And we do this in a seminar format limited to 20 students max. And over the course of teaching that seminar together, we realized, hey, we should develop this into a book. So what I say today is anything that's intelligible in it. Certainly the credit goes, a lot of it, to my colleague, Chris Tollefson. I'm gonna basically have two parts to this. I'm gonna begin with outlining these two rival accounts of medicine and medical ethics that are reflected in the title. And then I'm going to illustrate this, and I made this decision actually last night on reflecting on the topic of this conference, on anthropology and its implications. I'm going to illustrate the two rival accounts specifically with respect to the subject of so-called gender affirmation. Why that? Not because that's the most important issue in medicine, but because I think it perhaps best illustrates the way that medicine has come to serve the modern self, as Carl Trueman in his lecture put it. And so let me begin with these two rival accounts, with how Chris Tollefson and I make sense of medicine's predicament today. So we observe that medical practitioners and those who want to become such practitioners confront basic questions. And this is true even if these questions are never explicitly asked or answered during their medical training. The questions are, what is medicine? What is medicine for? What does it mean to be a good doctor or a good practitioner of medicine? These questions are necessarily answered in the way we go about medicine, even if they're never explicitly answered. And if practitioners cannot answer these basic questions, or if their answers are wrong, that would seem to prefigure a crisis for both medicine and medical ethics, because then practitioners can't orient themselves within their profession, nor even think of their practice as a profession at all. Without some account of what the medical profession reasonably professes, without an account of medicine's purpose or end, its goal, its aim, then ethicists cannot articulate an ethics of medicine, an ethics proper to the practice that's more than just an external application of principles that are not necessarily related to the practice itself. And we believe that medicine, and as a result also medical ethics, faces precisely this sort of crisis. In answer to the question, what is medicine? According to the first account, what we call the provider of services model, medicine comprises a set of technical skills and resources that are offered by healthcare providers for the sake of patient well-being. The provider of services model reflects a consumerist approach to medicine, where well-being is understood principally in terms of the patient's considered, informed preferences being satisfied. Therefore, for the provider of services model, if an intervention is permitted by law, is technologically possible or feasible, and is autonomously desired and chosen by the patient, then medical practitioners should provide that intervention. Indeed, many would argue they are professionally obligated to do so. Thus, in the provider of services model, the work of physicians becomes demoralized, and its ethic becomes what the late philosopher H. Tristram Engelhardt identified as a morality of strangers. So in that morality of strangers, we may still agree to follow the law and to refrain from doing violence to the innocent without their consent. But within the boundaries of law and consent, whatever is technically possible is ethically permissible. What is permissible and is desired may also be ethically obligatory. And then medical ethics in that framework, medical ethics reduces to a set of procedures for negotiating a non-interference with patients' wishes to the extent possible. Medicine itself devolves into a powerful set of means to be used to satisfy the preferences and desires of those who are authorized legally and procedurally to choose. And among the many consequences of this provider of services model, we see the following three looming. First, professional authority erodes. If there's no objective standard or end or purpose or aim for medicine, then physician expertise is merely technical. It's expertise about how to make things happen. So instead of exercising the authority of expertise within a sphere constituted by their professional commitments, by what they profess, physicians come to work in a highly regulated domain in which the exercise of their own clinical judgment, their prudence, their prudential judgment, is neither possible nor desirable. No surprise then that declining professional authority is followed by the second consequence, a crisis of medical morale. And I talked about that in more detail last night. But if medicine is merely providing desired services to those who choose those services, then its pretense to a kind of moral seriousness is a charade. And its attempts at professionalism are a facade. Practice of medicine is characteristically grueling. Those who are engaged in it spend long hours under taxing circumstances. And I think it's not surprising that physicians working under such conditions who think of themselves largely as mere functionaries suffer high rates of burnout. Finally, when medicine is understood as the provision of healthcare services, as merely the provision of healthcare services, the physician's judgment, and particularly the physician's claims of conscience, come to be seen as in competition with the fundamental but minimal norms of the profession. So the exercise of physician conscience then is treated as the intrusion of private or personal concerns into transactions that should be governed by physicians' professional commitment to provide legally permitted services to patients who request those services. As a result, the medical profession and the broader society appear ready to do away altogether with the idea of the conscientious physician and to use the coercive powers of the profession and the state to compel physicians to participate in practices that violate norms that have guided medical practitioners for millennia. Talked about this on my first talk yesterday, or wait, when did I talk about this? Anyway, but the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario's rule that physicians must make timely and effective referrals for all interventions that are legal, including euthanasia, is an example of that. It's historically speaking, a rather startling new intervention to make sure that physicians don't allow their judgment to keep them from cooperating in practices that for literally 2 millennia would have been seen as unimaginable for physicians to practice. Now, although the provider of services model has been growing in influence over the past 2 generations, it continues to exist with an older account of medicine that still guides physicians' intuitions and practices in many, if not most, domains. And we call that the way of medicine, in which medicine is a paradigmatic practice, elevated to a profession because of its social importance, and which aims at the health of the patient. And by health, we mean an objective, that is to say, a genuine or real human good, which gives singular purpose to the practice of medicine. It is the pursuit of health that makes medicine not something else, right? It makes it not law, not teaching, although it involves teaching, not other kinds of practices. It's what makes medicine medicine. Now, no one denies, in my experience, no one denies that health is one of the things that medicine is for. But under the provider of services model, health is only a subjective and socially constructed concept, such that people might ask questions like, well, whose health are you talking about? And who says what health requires? And what about my health? What if I say that my health requires X or Y or Z? And many people see health as only one of many goals toward which medicine might reasonably be aimed. By contrast, in the way of medicine, the good physician orients her practice centrally around the good of health. And physicians need only pursue those items related to health, and the profession as a whole should, to the extent possible, avoid entanglement with goods other than health, except when necessary to understand and address patients' health-related needs. Medical practitioners must also reduce inducements to act in ways that contradict the good of health. And that commitment dates back at least to Hippocrates and the Hippocratic oaths promise to give no deadly potion, no matter how much implored, nor cause an abortion. Basically, again, no matter how much the physician's implored to do so. In the way of medicine, physicians are always justified in refusing to act in ways that would intentionally damage or destroy the good of the patient's health. And in the way of medicine, practitioners devote themselves not to health in some abstract sense, not to population health, but to the health of those patients they will attend. They make life-shaping commitments to care for particular vulnerable persons. So as a result, the patient occupies a privileged position in the physician's life as a focal point of her concern and care. And at the same time, the physician pursues the health of her particular patients, mindful that health is not the only good, nor are her patients the only ones in need. The way of medicine starts with attention to the kind of practice medicine is, again, a practice oriented to the patient's health. But it doesn't stop there. People who pursue the health of patients must do so in ways that respect the broader demands of ethics or practical reason or morality. We use those terms interchangeably. Put differently, the practice of medicine, we believe, has its own integrity, but that integrity depends on and is accountable to the requirements of practical reason. And the requirements of practical reason have been known under a number of names. One is natural law. Natural law is not law inscribed in the heavens, but is, one way to put this is, it's the practical reason that directs persons to act. C.S. Lewis identified another name, the Tao, as some of you will recall, in his little essay, The Abolition of Man, as a synonym for practical reason and natural law. And he describes the Tao as the source of all value judgments. The various names point to the same reality. Practical reason's identification of that which is genuinely good for human beings, that is conducive to human flourishing, and the corollary implications for what we should do and how we should live. So what goods contribute to human flourishing? There are multiple that give people basic and fundamental reasons to act, but certainly these include friendship, knowledge, and they include health. We humans are better off if we're healthy. Health is not only good in order to achieve some other purpose, and it certainly is good for that reason. If you don't have health, you've heard the saying, if you don't have health, you don't have anything. That's not true, but it is reflecting something that's true, which is health makes possible the pursuit of many, many other goods that are constitutive of human flourishing. But health is good in itself as well. It's reasonable for you to say, why are you going to the gym? Because I want to be healthy. Doesn't sound like the sort of thing where you go, well, why do you want to be healthy, right? Or why are you eating that salad? Because I want to be healthy. Well, why would you want to be healthy? We want to be healthy because being healthy makes us better off. So we find that the internal norms of the practice of medicine are strongly confirmed by what practical reason or ethics or morality requires. There's much more to be said on that, this introduction to these two accounts of medicine. I encourage you to buy the book, obviously, and to read it and to let us know where you think our account needs further correction, further development or correction. But I've said enough to see that there are two rival accounts here that are operative in physicians' practice. In one, medicine is a moral art or a practice oriented to the patient's health, which is just genuine good. And in the other, medicine is the provision of healthcare services to serve a subjective account of well-being. Now, how do these two accounts play out? In the book, we go through a number of different areas: the nature of the doctor-patient relationship, end-of-life issues, beginning-of-life issues, the questions of conscience. But I'm going to here turn again to this area of gender affirmation to illustrate the way these two accounts work differently and lead to different conclusions about how we should respond to gender dysphoria. And partly I told you part of why I choose this. I also should say I choose to speak about this because I have found this is a topic that is so fraught that few will speak about it in public. And so I think given my vocation as a teacher, as someone in the university, as someone who has tenure, it's important for me to speak about it in a civil way that reflects those commitments of the university and my own commitment to truth. So I practice palliative medicine. I have no direct experience caring for patients seeking treatments for gender dysphoria, but I am frequently contacted by colleagues, and I've noticed in the recent years, it's been particularly pediatrician colleagues who are encountering increasing numbers of children and adolescents with gender identity questions. And their parents, of course, wondering, what do we do with this? And I come at this as this issue primarily as someone concerned about the ethical practice of medicine in our time and about practicing medicine with integrity, including practicing medicine with integrity as a Christian. So let me start by asking why this cultural phenomenon is arising now. If you were here yesterday for Carl Trueman's opening lecture, and or if you've read his book, The Rise and Fall of the Modern Self, I'm sorry, not The Rise and Fall, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, you'll know that he begins his introduction with asking how and why a particular statement has come to be regarded as coherent and meaningful. Namely, I am a woman trapped in a man's body. Like what happened culturally such that when we hear that, we understand that to be a plausible statement. As a physician, I begin by asking, what has made it possible, for better or worse, for so many in our time to imagine that their secondary sex characteristics are at odds with their true identity, with their true selves, and are in the way of their flourishing, come to obstruct their flourishing? Men and women have always faced the question, who are you? But in modern times, this question of identity has become a lot more fraught. For most people throughout history, their identity was simply received, was given, it was unquestioned. Who am I? I'm Simon, son of Jonah. I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. Who am I? I am Anne, daughter of James and Carol of Brompton Parish. Who am I? I am Kikuyu, Quiche, Crow, English, American. I'm slave, serf, freeman, lord. I'm a cooper, smith, tailor, boatwright, fisher. A central feature of modernity and the rise of the modern self has been questioning and challenging all such received identities. And in important respects, this feature of modernity, it seems to me, is inspired by the witness of the church, by Christian tradition. So Jesus famously scrambled the conventions of his time regarding identity, claiming that his family members were those who do his will, that not the people who happen to be related to him by blood. That whoever would be first among his followers must be servant of all, that his kingdom was not of this world. Paul taught the churches, think here of the church in Galatia, that there is in the church neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So Christians are taught to say that our identity is not in our nationality, it's not in our race, it's not in our age, our social position, our economic class. Our identity, likewise, is not in our sexual inclinations or gender preferences. Rather, we are creatures made in God's image, beloved by God, invited to become brothers and sisters of Christ, to be adopted through baptism and faith into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which gives us then our fundamental identity. So Christianity itself teaches us to hold lightly the identities that the world assigns us. But whereas Christianity calls us to hold those lightly in order to receive our true identity in Christ, modern culture calls us to throw off all received identities in order to discover and enact our own unique identity, our authentic, original identity. So our time is characterized by what the philosopher Charles Taylor called the ethics of authenticity, according to which your primary moral project is to create yourself through your own authentic choices that are true to you. We see this message, it seems to me, in virtually every ad campaign on television and in every Disney movie storyline, right? A product promises to set us apart from the crowd. You're going to drive that car and you're not going to be like all those other people, right? You're going to wear these clothes. You're not going to be like all those other people. You're going to be distinctive, edgy, different, unique. The great challenge for the protagonist in every Disney film is to throw off everybody's expectations, right? They say, you know, you got to throw that off, look inside, discover one's own authentic self, and then live that out. You be you. It's a really powerful message. And it's a subject of another conversation, but the church has been deeply influenced by this pattern. As the term liberalism suggests, this throwing off of received identities is meant to bring liberation. It's meant to make us free from what would otherwise shackle us. And insofar as that which we throw off is a false identity and therefore a hindrance to our genuine fulfillment, it does. So someone says, and Christianity has been a tradition that's witness to this. Someone says to you, you are a slave. You know, the church, of course, this is not addressing the church's complicity in slavery in all kinds of ways, but the church, you know, what brings about the end of slavery as well is the witness of the church that no, that's a false identity. Ultimately, you are a beloved child of God who is equal to the one who in this world is put forward as your master. Your true identity is as brothers and sisters in Christ. Okay, but the rise and triumph of the modern self has brought a cloud of anxiety to the question of identity, because the onus is on each of us to create ourselves and do so in an original way. And if we fail to distinguish ourselves from others, then we get lost. We disappear. And it seems to me that is the anxiety that Charles Taylor talks about this in some depth, that runs all through. When you think about all the anxiety with teenagers today, it's sort of a picture of this working itself out. If you can't be distinctively yourself in a way that's both affirmed by others and yet is not reducible to what others are doing, you feel like you're going to disappear. I propose to you that those who experience gender dysphoria, pain or confusion or even repulsion regarding their otherwise healthy secondary sex characteristics are caught in the pincer of social pressures brought about by the effects of cultural liberalism, carried to its logical conclusions in both the domain of sexuality and the domain of medicine. So in the domain of sexuality, this quest for authenticity has played out in a constantly shifting confusion of sexual identities. So we have the LGBTQIA+, you know, and on it goes. New letters are added almost on a monthly basis, it seems. They're added as people reject the repressive limits of the previous categories. So, I mean, as soon as LGBT was a category, people who understand themselves as queer are like, I'm not LGBT. That's a repressive, limited box. You have to add Q. And as soon as that's added, what about I? And then what about A? And then what about plus? Each new identity is less stable than the last. And in a kind of tragic consistency, this logic has now resulted in people seeking to escape the repressive influence of their own healthy bodies. And medicine becomes an important tool then in throwing off the constraints of the body in order to be true to one's authentic self that now is ephemeral, right? That is not in, that somehow is inhabiting the body in some kind of relationship to the body, but is not the body proper. And you need to do that in order to, in terms of the ethics of authenticity, to stop living a lie, right? If you don't change the body, you're effectively trapped in a lie that you are a man when really, as you understand it, you're not, even if your sex is male. Now, for a long time, again, more than 2,000 years, Jews, pagans, Christians, later Muslims, deists, skeptics, practiced medicine in pursuit of the patient's health, where health was understood as a real thing, not a mere social construct, not a value as opposed to a fact, not something one makes up, rather something one observes, respects, and values. And we value health not because we're told to, but we value it because it's good. It makes us better off again. But that tradition is being steadily eroding and being cast off in place of the provider of services model, because the provider of services model allows for more support for that authentic individual development, including by using medical technology on the body in accordance with people's sense of their authentic development. So today, rather than seeking a patient's health per se, physicians seek a patient's well-being, and well-being is determined by what the patient authentically chooses. And now, carrying this logic to its next conclusion, doctors at places like Duke University, where I work, it's probably true at University of Toronto, I would assume it is, are using exogenous hormones and surgery to change the secondary sex characteristics of those who experience those characteristics as somehow not consistent with their identity, and therefore as an obstacle to their authentic development. That's the logic that has given rise to the modern self that Carl Trueman writes about. And it's followed to the point that we treat the body itself, in fact, we treat our existence as human organisms, as mammals that are, like other mammals, by nature, male and female. We treat that as yet another external constraint that we need to throw off in order to forge an authentic original self. You be you. And in these practices that physicians are cooperating with now, physicians work with patients and their families to enact what we take to be stark contradictions here. These are not just wrong, but these are things that are internally, utterly inconsistent, self-contradictory. So in the name of affirming, right, this is called gender affirmation. So the logic is that in order to affirm who an individual is, physicians must reject the individual as he or she is, he or she or they, whatever term is used. Does that make sense? You're going to affirm by rejecting what they are, how they are. Based on the idea that gender is merely socially constructed, this is a very important idea for rationalizing these kinds of interventions, that gender is merely socially constructed. It's wholly separable from sex, not dependent on biology, not dependent on anatomy. Then physicians engage in interventions that change the biology and the anatomy on which the gender supposedly does not depend. So if gender is wholly separate from biology and anatomy, why then would our conclusion be we need to change biology and anatomy to match a certain gender perception? Another contradiction. Another one is, in order to get beyond, it's argued, the repressive limits of the sexual binary, too narrow, not wide enough for reality, to get beyond that to the broader diversity of reality, we are to reify the binary by seeking to produce secondary sex characteristics or the appearance of such characteristics that are determined by the binary, right? So what do we do to the female who has the transgender female who perceives herself to be male? We shape her body to make it look like a male's body, right? Reifying the very binary that we're supposedly trying to get beyond. And as part of our stand against hate, this kind of relates to the issue about affirmation, we join an individual in hating himself, his bodily existence, which there's no scientific reason to suggest that the self is other than the living body that's in front of a person. So in order to resist hate, we join them in a hostility toward the body as it is, cutting off, destroying, blocking. And so therefore, to affirm and include, we cut off and destroy. These contradictions would be comical if they did not result in such tragic consequences for real people, and we can say for real people whom God loves and has made in God's image. Here I think again of C.S. Lewis and The Abolition of Man. For those of you who've read it, you'll remember that he's talking about what does it mean for us to have conquest over nature. And he says, the conquest over nature is a double-edged sword because, and here I quote, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. As long as this process stops short of the final stage, he continues, we may well hold that the gain outweighs the loss. But as soon as we take the final step of reducing our own species to the level of mere nature, the whole process is stultified. For this time, the being who stood to gain and the being who had been sacrificed are one and the same. This is one of the many instances where to carry a principle to what seems its logical conclusion produces absurdity. So the being who stood to gain, think about gender affirmation procedures. There's this young person, let's say this 14-year-old girl, who stands to gain through these interventions. And the one who's going to be sacrificed, whose healthy breasts and healthy sexual development of ovaries and so on is going to be sacrificed, are one and the same. And that seems to me aptly describes the technological gender affirmation, quote unquote, gender affirmation interventions. Let me close with reflections on two things briefly. One, the role of medicine with respect to gender dysphoria in the two rival accounts. I'm just going to go through that briefly. And then just some brief notes on how Christians might respond to questions about gender. So just imagine you have this young person named Jules, an otherwise healthy 13-year-old boy who suffers from gender dysphoria. He identifies as female and wishes to take hormone-blocking supplements that will delay puberty until he's old enough to undergo a full sexual transition, which, if it's completed, will involve sexual reassignment surgery to remove his male sex organs and to provide female facsimiles by means of plastic surgery. That's the path if you follow it all the way. So in the provider services model, remember, health is a subjective construct, and that really is better described as well-being, and well-being depends on what the patient wants. So in that model, no surprise that if someone like a young person like Jules really desires this, really feels it, sincerely longs for it, and particularly if his parents are supportive, then physicians should provide what's being sought. Just a brief note again, connecting to Carl Trueman's lecture, this connects very much to and reflects the modern self. And it's, he talked both the ethics of authenticity, which I've talked about, but he talked about the difference between a posture of mimesis versus poiesis toward the world. So in mimesis, a mimetic posture, we see the world as a reality that we want to live in accord with. We want to understand and shape our lives to fit the reality of the world. Poiesis is more, we see the world as stuff that we want to shape to fit our projects, right? To make it work for us. In this case, the body itself becomes the substance we work with to shape our own narrative. In the case of Jules, it indicates how far this logic extends. If the goals of medicine are rightly determined by the informed choices of autonomous patients, by what patients determines good for them, then perhaps also the form of healthy secondary sex characteristics should be determined by the informed choices of patients, by what patients decide are the right secondary sex characteristics for them. And that is exactly what happens with gender affirmation interventions. So in these, again, you use exogenous hormones, surgical treatments to block puberty and to fashion as closely as possible secondary sex characteristics that appear to match the patient's gender identity or gender preference. And so the provider services model, notice this, treats the Jules's sexual organs and underlying sexual physiology as either a good to be preserved or a harm to be remedied and gotten rid of, strictly on the basis of the patient's self-perception. All right. I think we would all agree, and I say this measuredly to not, but I think it's an important point to make. If we found any young person who had done to them what is being done in these clinics, and it turned out the young person said, I did not want this, and the parents said, we did not want this, I think it'd be universal agreement, not only that the autonomy had been violated, but there had been an egregious harm to this young person. And notice that's different. You find a kid who had a ruptured appendix and says, I don't want surgery, and the parents are not available, and you say, well, you're having surgery. You take them to surgery, you take out the ruptured appendix, now they're recovering and they're healthy afterward. You might still argue that a harm has been done in terms of a violation of the kid's autonomy or the parent's autonomy, but you wouldn't argue in the same way that they'd been harmed with respect to health. Okay, that's the provider services model. In the way of medicine, again, we start with a claim that, put simply, humans are animal organisms, and like other organisms, our existence is sexed. We are male or female organisms, not in virtue of assignment at birth, but in virtue of having a root capacity for reproductive function, even if that capacity is immature or damaged for a number of different reasons that can happen. And as with countless other species, the human reproductive function is performed jointly by two organisms of opposite sexes. No individual human being suffices for the performance of reproduction. This is not a religious idea. It's not a spiritual idea. It's just a fact that we observe of human biology. And the way of medicine, in its orientation to the patient's health, resists any inducement to interfere with, interrupt, or otherwise revise the healthy development, maturation, and function of male and female sexual organs and capacities, because these are part of health. They are, without their development, a central aspect of health, namely the capacity to reproduce, is rendered impossible. Moreover, those who seek to change a person's sex not only contradict medicine's orientation to health, but they also always and necessarily fail in what they attempt. Here, the logic of the provider services model leads to absurd contradictions. So you have people justifying changing secondary sex characteristics by claiming that one's phenotypic or genetic properties can be at odds with their real sex. And what is the real sex? It's a feature of some disembodied reality to which only the individual has access. Others justify such interventions by claiming that there's no such thing as one's real sex. And with these mutual incompatible claims, we see the further contradictions that I've already mentioned. Changing secondary sex characteristics does not actually change sex. It cannot, because to change an organism's sex would be to make a male organism capable of engaging in the female sex act, or vice versa. Sex change interventions or gender transition interventions don't do that. They can't do that. Rather, they culminate in surgeries to remove sexual organs, for example, a penis or a vagina, and to refashion simulacra of the organs that members of the opposite sex characteristically possess. Again, constrained by the binary that they're supposed to be getting beyond. But those are not, in fact, those organs. That's not a penis that's being refashioned. It's not a vagina that's being refashioned. It's the appearance of that. And unfortunately, the provider of services model seems increasingly committed to ignoring these antinomies and contradictions posed by granting patients the gender transition or gender affirmation interventions they seek. And this leads to tragic consequences. These interventions often irreversibly damage the health of the patient. I am encouraged that now things are starting to leak out. The press is starting to allow out reports of the reality that, for example, you guys may have seen in recent months, some of the most prominent surgeons who have done these sex change operations are saying, hang on, you're blocking the maturation of children. Therefore, they're never going through puberty. Therefore, they will never experience sexual stimulation. They will never develop the tissues that we've counted on in the past to actually use to refashion the appearance of sex. So not to be too detailed here, but the scrotum has been used in the past to help refashion the appearance of a vagina. The clitoris has been used to make a stimulatable appearance of a penis. That's not possible now because kids are having those young people that are having their puberty blocked will never have sufficient tissue to make that possible. These are irreversible damages. But because these interventions are patient chosen, the provider services model and its surrounding social and legal culture not only permit physicians to conduct these interventions, but increasingly charge physicians who refuse to participate in them or cooperate with them with abandoning their professional obligations to put the patients first. The way of medicine cannot countenance doing to Jules what he asks. And it's not because of bigotry, it's not because of phobia, it's because in solidarity with a patient like Jules, medical practitioners know they only should act in ways that are congruent with the patient's health. To give another example, which I know is somewhat controversial but I think it's an important one. If a young woman who has an incredibly low BMI sees herself as overweight, right? Whose woman is very thin, sees herself as overweight, we teach that manifests a disorder of perception. And a good physician shows no disrespect to this young woman if the physician refuses to facilitate further weight loss through, which he could do. We have techniques to facilitate further weight loss. Rather, those refusals are part and parcel of the physician's commitment as a physician to care for the patient. So similarly, with respect to Jules, he deserves our care and attention, but the problem is not the presence of male secondary sex characteristics. Rather, he suffers a disorder of perception regarding his nature as a human being, one who is irrevocably and irreducibly male. Okay, just a few words on how Christians might respond to questions about gender. Three brief things. First, I think we can remind each other and tenaciously hold on to the fact that being made male and female is good. This is one of the things that is good. Our maleness and femaleness, it is a fact. It's a feature of the human condition we cannot avoid. It's part of our being animals. But it's also good. Genesis 1:27 says, so God created man in his image, and the term there, Adam, as you guys know better than I, speaks of humankind. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Our being made male and female is part of our imaging God. That's the first thing. Second, we remind each other that our secondary sex characteristics, the things about males and females that mark us and distinguish us as male and female, and that ultimately are kind of ordered toward that possibility. It's not going to be realized in every case, but that possibility of forming a union, which gives rise to a new family, those likewise are good. They express health. They together and only together make possible human reproduction, forming of new families. And because they're good, healthy secondary sex characteristics should not be destroyed, no matter how repulsed one feels toward them. And the reality is people who are experiencing gender dysphoria do experience distress and repulsion at their bodies. That's an enormous burden that they're bearing. But the answer to that is not to turn hostile toward those characteristics. Finally, we're called to practice patience toward one another and bear up with one another, as some will suffer sexual inclinations they do not want and gender confusion they do not want. And the church is made for people who are searching for their identity. Through the church, Jesus is inviting them, as he's inviting us, to receive our identity, our true, sure, unshakable identity in him. He can deal with our confusions, our perceptions, our longings, and our struggles. I'll stop there. Thank you.